Yes. Okay. So let me just jump in because I have like so much to cover. So today we'll be talking about forming a business in the United States. Okay. And so why would like a foreign entity or foreign person decide to incorporate in the US, right? It's most likely you guys already have an existing company, perhaps in your home jurisdiction in your home country, but you would like to perhaps extend your sales or customer base to the US and possibly also raise funding, right? So actually it's pretty easy, like comparing to many other countries I've heard it's really easy to open an entity in the US. It takes like 24 hours, and you can also open a bank account online without actually a physical presence in the US. And you can also start operating your company, your US entity, while being outside of the United States. You can hire employees, you can enter into agreements, they can all be signed by DocuSign and such. So it's actually possible for you to have an operating US entity without actually even being here in the US. So let's just talk about some other advantages of incorporating in the US. You get limited liability protection, right? That means that creditors cannot reach to your personal assets to satisfy, debts or obligations of the corporation. So the personal property of the shareholders is protected, but only so long as corporate formalities are observed. And I'll talk about corporate formalities in a little bit. Okay, an entity can also own intellectual property that you create. Well, obviously, individuals can own intellectual property as well. And here I'm talking about trademarks, copyrights, patents, right? But when all founders contribute, their IP to the entity, it's an asset, right? So the entity owns IP, can enter into license agreements, can sell IP, and so on. And then, for many of the tech startups, IP is their main asset, right, that they're building. An entity can also hire employees or enter into independent contractor agreements. And also, as I said, limited liability is super important. When you are launching a service or you start selling products, you do want that protection, okay? And also for the foreign founders, you can use that entity to obtain visas and to solve your immigration kind of questions, right? And obviously it can get funded. And it can also issue stock options to employees, as part of compensation. So now let's jump right into this, okay? The first thing that I would like you to remember is to talk to a tax lawyer or an accountant before actually opening an entity, like forming a company. As I said, opening a corporation is super easy. It takes 24 hours and you have it, okay? What's more difficult is to figure out the exact legal structure that you need, okay? Choices like, include maybe creating side-by-side two parallel entities, one in the US and one in your home jurisdiction, and then have the same owners, right, for both. Or maybe you'll decide to create a holding company structure, and maybe the holding company will be somewhere offshore, like maybe Cayman Islands, right? And then that company may have different companies like under it, like subsidiaries, US and European entities or whatever, wherever you are. Or it could be just a parent subsidiary structure. So there is a parent company, let's say Delaware Corporation, and then it holds 100% of shares of a local entity. And that is typically done by doing a Delaware flip, where, like, let's say you have an entity, let's say in France, for example, you have already a company in France, and France is your home jurisdiction, your state, and to do a Delaware flip, what you would do is you would open, like, you would form a Delaware corporation, and then Delaware corporation would issue shares, right, to the shareholders of a French company. So this way, they contribute, and then the French shareholders, they contribute their shares that they hold in French company to the Delaware corporation, right, in exchange for its shares. So, and you kind of flip the ownership, so then shareholders of a French company become shareholders of the Delaware company, and Delaware company becomes the sole owner of the French company. So that's kind of a Delaware flip structure, and that's parent subsidiary structure. That's how you do it. Okay, so what are the common entity types? So I've listed, several, but corporation and the limited liability company are the most common types. Okay, so what is a corporation? Okay, there are three parties involved in a corporation. There are shareholders, owners of the company, right? Shareholders. Shareholders elect a board of directors. Okay, every corporation must have a board of directors. Directors can be the same people as shareholders, right? They can be different. They can be independent directors, let's say, or directors, let's say you get funded and a representative of your investors will join the board, right? So typically a small startup, starts with maybe 2, 3, let's say, person board, and then the number can grow to over 10 over time, of course. Okay, so board of directors all fiduciary duties of loyalty and care, right, to the shareholders. And then the board appoints executive officers, meaning chief executive officer, chief financial officer, and so on. And at any given time, the board can fire, right, executive officers, but also shareholders can, they elect directors, right, to the board of directors at the annual meetings. And if bylaws so provide, then they can actually fire directors as well from the board. So that's how a corporation works. Okay, I previously mentioned corporate formalities. They're super important. And the main, I would say, point here I'd like to make is the corporation or an LLC, whatever legal entity you choose to create, needs to have its own bank account. Okay, and you cannot commingle funds, your personal funds and the corporation's funds. Think of a corporation as as a legal person, right? And you cannot just go into the corporation's bank account, take money, move money to your personal, then move money back. So that commingling of funds is a red flag for the courts when they're deciding the question of whether or not limited liability protection is still, should be honored, right? Okay, and then you have certain other corporate formalities, such as, need to hold periodic board meetings and record the decisions of the board, right? So every major decision of the corporation should be made by the board of directors, and there should be a record of it, either written consent or minutes of a meeting. Limited liability company is super flexible. There are members, right? Sometimes LLC can be member managed. Sometimes it is manager managed, and members are more like passive, right? Members. Sometimes it's called, it's either manager or member managed. Managers can be also members, but don't have to be. And basically, it's a pretty flexible structure, and it all depends on what's in the operating agreement of an LLC. So operating agreement is the key document of the limited liability company. Okay, so where do we incorporate? Well, okay, so in the US, you have choices. So first of all, it's done on a state level, right? Not federal level. So when you form a company, it's a state level. So we are choosing from all of the states, right? So home state, by that I mean where you will be doing business. Let's say, you intend to set up operations in New York, perhaps that makes sense for you to open a New York operation, right? But for many startups, like especially tech startups, right, the choice is Delaware. Delaware has the most developed body of corporate law. It has a dedicated court that is there just to hear business-related disputes. And it is, I think, the most respected out of all states, corporate, set of corporate laws, right? And if your startup is going to be raising funds, then I think most, if not all, VCs or, like angel investors expect you to be a Delaware corporation, right? Because obviously they are familiar with the laws, and they're also familiar with the fiduciary duties should they be, should they happen to be on the company's board. So Delaware is kind of the choice here. Then there are also about 8 to 10 states that don't have corporate income tax. So to the extent that you are going to be doing business there, maybe it makes sense to incorporate there as well. One of such states is Florida. Okay. Also, you need to know that so you'll have the home state, right? I mean, the state where you incorporate. Let's say you choose Delaware, but then you also need to qualify to do business in every state where you're actually doing business, conducting business. Let's say your Delaware corporation has an office in New York. So you are doing business in New York, and therefore you need to register in New York as well. Okay. That's that. So just a couple of words about taxes. So in the US, we have 3 levels of taxation: federal, state, and local. So federal, let's say corporation pays a fixed tax of like 21% on taxable profits. So profits is, revenue minus all the expenses, but obviously it's much more complicated than this. But that's it, 21%. In addition to that, the corporation will pay state and local tax. As opposed to the corporation, LLC does not pay tax on its own. There are some exceptions in New York, but let's not get into the exceptions. Just conceptually, LLCs don't pay tax because they're pass-through entities, right? Unless they elect to be treated as a corporation for tax reasons, but that's also complicating things. So tax in an LLC is paid by its members, meaning owners of an LLC. So very different conceptually, right? Corporation pays its own tax. LLC doesn't. In an LLC, it's the members who pay. Okay. Remember that US corporations, even if the shareholders are non-US persons, even if they are not located in the US, even if the US corporation does not even have a bank account in the US, right? It still must pay corporate income tax on its, taxable profits, right? Derived from, operations in the US. So, and let's say you have a corporation, but it's dormant. It's not doing anything, or maybe it's losing money. You still have to file tax return, okay? Even if no tax is due, you would still need to file every year corporate tax return. And for that, you need to work with an accountant. So before you actually open your US corporations, you need to have 2 allies on your side: a corporate lawyer and an accountant, business accountant, okay? And they don't kind of work in the same firm. In the US, law firms can only be owned by lawyers, right, and only provide legal services, and accounting firms are like that as well. They can only provide accounting, but not legal services, okay? So that's why you need both. Okay, so what are the steps to incorporate? Well, first of all, you need to check whether the name that you chose is available. Okay, it needs to be available as a name in the Delaware, registry, right? And that's easy to check online. And if you want to use the same name as your brand, then it should also be available as a trademark. Ask your lawyer to check for both before you settle on a name, right? Sometimes, let's say, companies come up with like some boring name, and then register and do business, right, under that name, but then their brand is different, or maybe they will have several brands. So, but that does not mean that their legal name is the same as the brand name, okay? So what do you do to incorporate? You prepare and you file a certificate of incorporation. Okay, the filing fee is about $250, and here I'm using Delaware as an example. And incorporation in Delaware takes 24 hours. It can be done in 2 hours, but you would have to expedite extra, right? Every Delaware corporation, unless it is actually located in the state of Delaware, right, needs to have a registered agent. These are companies that provide their services. They cost about $50 a year. And the reason why they're there is so that if, let's say, somebody sues you, the company, they can serve the complaint on the Delaware Secretary of State, and Delaware Secretary of State needs to know where to forward it. And so they're going to forward it to the company's registered agent, and the registered agent will have your contact information on file, and then will immediately forward to you the complaint, so you don't lose time. Okay, so incorporator signs the certificate of incorporation. Incorporator is the person, can be anyone over the age of 18, okay? Can be any individual. I often, let's say, act as incorporator for the companies, for my clients, okay? So then what do? Get a virtual address, or if you already, you've already relocated here, then get an office address. Then your incorporator prepares the bylaws and elects the initial board of directors, okay? Corporation must have a board of directors, and that's how you get it. And companies need to obtain EIN. EIN is a number that you obtain from the Internal Revenue Service, and you need to have it in order to open a bank account. You just need an EIN in order to operate. So, so you obtain that, your lawyer can assist or your accountant can assist, and then the board appoints officers and authorizes sale of stock to the founders. The founders then purchase the stock, and the stock should be subject to vesting, okay? So that's just to ensure that the founders don't walk away with all this shares without actually doing much work for the company. Unfortunately, I'm out of time. Otherwise, I would tell you more about vesting. And then obviously, you worry about intellectual property, right? So you want to make sure that all intellectual property that was created for the company prior to the formation of the company gets assigned to the company. So founders enter into IP assignment agreements. And then you want to make sure that all intellectual property that's going to be created after the formation of the company is also belongs to the company, and therefore your founders and then your employees and everybody else will, who's working for the company, will sign confidentiality and invention assignment agreements. Okay. So you could ask, this is a question that I get once in a while. Okay, so what are let's say you have this company and it's not active, right? You just have a US corporation, but it's not active. So how much will it cost you to have it? Okay, so you pay once a year before March 1st of each year. You need to file an annual report that's done online, right? And pay franchise tax in Delaware, okay? So this is just for the privilege of being a Delaware corporation. That's so you don't pay to the IRS, Internal Revenue Service. This is just an annual fee that the state of Delaware charges. And let's say it's going to be approximately $400. That's assuming you have an active company and you have, let's say, 10 million shares authorized. Then once a year, you renew your registered agent subscription, right? So it's 50. You will have an address, a virtual address that can forward you mail, about 400. And then you will be working with accountant to file annual tax return. So maybe do some minimal bookkeeping. I don't know exactly how much that will cost you. Let's say 2,000. Okay. So basically, I'm thinking that just to maintain an inactive corporation in Delaware will be about, let's say, $3,000 a year. And that's it. And I just want to say a word of encouragement. There are many founders, right? Foreign founders, and in 55% of US unicorns, right? There was at least one immigrant founder. Okay. But just one word about immigration. I know you're going to talk with immigration lawyers later, but remember, a foreigner, a non-US person, can own shares of, let's say, Delaware Corporation, of a U.S. legal entity, okay? But let's say we're talking about C Corporation, okay? We're talking about Delaware Corporation. So a foreign non-U.S. person can own shares and become a shareholder of a Delaware C Corporation. However, that person cannot work for its own, for their own company in the U.S. unless they're authorized to do so. Okay, so you can work for this company from outside of the US, that's fine. But as soon as you are on the US soil, you need to make sure you have proper visa, proper authorization, green card, whatever, to work on your company here in the US. And that's all I have for you. And that's it. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Arina, for such deep and detailed speech. I have one more question about what's major difference between LLC and C Corp, like when you spoke about like liabilities. So is it works both with LLC and C Corp, only with a C Corp, S Corp, and so on?
Okay, so both types of entities have limited liability protection. Okay, S corps as well, but S corps actually, I know it wasn't your question, but I just want to say they're not available as an entity choice for foreign persons. Okay, only green card holders or US citizens can be shareholders of an S corp. Right, so that's why I didn't even mention that. C corps, LLCs, they both forms have limited liability protection so long as corporate formalities are properly observed. And in terms of corporate structure, look, investors prefer, obviously, to invest into corporations, okay? Not LLCs. Also, it's much easier to issue like equity as compensation in corporate setting, right? In an LLC, it's like it's very complex. Okay, they're called profit interests, and everybody gets a K1. It's just very it's hard to understand for most people, just how exactly the reporting is done for an LLC. So it's much more complex, okay? So if you're ready to raise funds, if that's the plan, then definitely become a corporation and don't, yeah. So, okay, Dima has a question.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Arina, for your presentation. And my question is regarding addresses. Like my co-founder is in the US, he has a green card, and I'm outside of the US. Like we register C Corp and we have like registered agent address, right? But you said about virtual address, it's usually for people who never go to US kind of with their company, as you said, who works outside, and they just make virtual address to forward all the mail. Could you elaborate on this, like mailing on type of addresses if you have like a US co-founder
Presence, yeah. So
presence.
look, I think it's also a question of privacy, right? So if you have a virtual address, okay, fine. If you have an office, an actual office, right, to go to, and it's a business address, go ahead and use it, obviously, right? Nowadays, people, like a lot of people work remotely. They kind of work from home, right? Well, at least in the US. And yes, of course, they can list their personal address, but would they want that to be disclosed, to be like on different filings and so on? So, some people prefer to use just a virtual address that, I mean, it's not expensive. And then just have them forward mail to, like a person's residence.
We have one more
Yeah.
question.
My quick addition. I meant, is it okay if this business address is not in Delaware? Because this virtual address, you do usually Delaware kind of address, right? And they forward you wherever you want. But if it's like not Delaware, everything.
Oh yes, it's totally
okay?
fine. Yes, and look, in Delaware, some people confuse the registered agent address as the address of the company, and that's not the case. Okay, so you're not authorized to use registered agent address as the address of the company unless you enter into a separate agreement with the registered agent, pay them extra, right? Not $50 more per month. And then they give you the permission to do so. Otherwise, it's just an address of the registered agent, and you need the registered agent to be, to get the complaints if there are any complaints served from the company.
Okay, but business address is any other address in the US.
It can be, it can be in New York, it can be in California. There are plenty of online virtual service providers that you can sign up for online. And some of them will just take all the mail and just send it to you physically, in an envelope. And others can like open and scan and then send it to you by email.
Okay, maybe one more quick question regarding this presence in the US.
Jim, sorry. We have two more questions. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Are QSBS tax benefits also works for non-US founders?
Well, yes, if they become later on, if they become US persons, because it's a concept of a US tax, right, code. So that kicks in if you are selling the company, right? If you're paying US taxes, then QSBS tax treatment is very, very important. And so make sure that it is a corporation, right? Because that only applies to corporations. Hold shares for at least 5 years, right? And make sure that the company doesn't be very careful about repurchases. Okay, like the company repurchasing its own stock from anyone. So just that can disqualify the QSBS tax treatment of the shares even that belong to others that are not subject to repurchase. So just check with lawyers before you do any of that, okay? Because it's a very sensitive rule. There are many conditions.
It's quite specific questions. Better to discuss with your CPA. I think so.
Yeah. CPAs and lawyers, absolutely.
And lawyers. Last question, more about the private liability. I think so. If you are O1 or EB1 and start to be tax residents in end of the year, like previous one in 2022, and you sold your apartment and car in January of like current year, what should you do? Like, should you pay taxes or not?
Oh, I have no idea. Talk to the accountants.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Arina. So like for your presentation.